This is Beyond the Business.
We usually talk about the ocean as in nature, as something emotional, beautiful, fragile, and worth protecting. But that framing misses the point. The ocean is not a collection of animals, it is not a list of species, and it is definitely not a moral argument. The ocean is a system, and like any system, it works only while all its variables remain in place. Today, I will talk about disappearing species we barely recognize, and the conversation often sounds abstract. Nothing seems to change immediately. Markets don't react, shelves stay full, and prices barely move. So it feels like the system is still working. But that's the illusion, because in living systems, disappearance is never subtraction, it is reconfiguration. Remove one variable, and the entire equation changes, slowly, unevenly, and often invisibly at first. This episode is not about saving animals, not about activism, not about guilt. It's about understanding the ocean as an equation where every species, visible or not, edible or not, plays a functional role, and where the consequences of removing variables don't arrive instantly, but always arrive system wide. Let's talk about the ocean not as a nature, but as an equation. Welcome to the ocean of waste. When people hear the word equation, they picture school. A whiteboard, a formula, clean problem, and clean answer. But in reality, an equation is not a school thing. An equation is the most honest way to describe how any system stays functional. Because an equation is not a slogan, it is a relationship. It tells you one brutal truth. If you change one variable, the whole system changes with it. Not emotionally and not politically, but mathematically. An equation is a structure where the outcome depends on the integrity of the inputs. And in engineered systems, we respect that. If you run a ship's propulsion system, you don't treat one component as optional. You don't say, we will remove this valve, but it should still work. You can optimize, you can upgrade, you can redesign, but you cannot remove a variable without changing the behavior of the system. In engineering, that's obvious. In the natural world, we pretend it's not. Because nature looks different. It looks a background. But it's not a background, it's an operating system. So, what is an equation in systems terms? And it's a balance of functions, of inputs, outputs, feedback loops, constraints, thresholds, time lags, and most importantly, dependencies. An equation is not just what exists, it is what each part does and how the system redistributes pressure when something changes. And that's where living systems become different from simple math on a paper. A real system is not static, a real system adapts. So, in a living system, when you remove a variable, the system doesn't politely return error. It compensates and it relocates load. It reroutes energy and behavior across the network. And that is exactly why damage can be invisible at first. Because the equation keeps running just in a degraded mode. It's like a ship running with one generator down. Lights still work, radar still works, you can still move. But you're operating closer to a boundary and the system has less margin. Now translate that into the ocean. People talk about the ocean like it's a collection of things, like a fish and coral and turtles with the whales, and sometimes plastic and oil spills. As if the ocean is a kind of zoo. But the ocean is not a collection of animals. It is an equation, a dynamic equation that runs continuously on a planetary scale. And the variables of these equations are living organisms. Some are visible, some are microscopic, some are edible, and some are not. Some are economically important, some look irrelevant. But that's exactly the trap. In an equation, value is not determined by visibility. It's determined by function. A variable can look small and still hold the structure. A plankton bloom can matter more than a million-ton factory because it sits inside the oxygen cycle. A non-commercial fish can matter more than a commercial one because it is the bridge between two levels of the food chain. Species you never see can be a regulator of stability. So when I say the ocean is an equation, I mean something precise. Flora and fauna are variables. The food chain is the architecture. Stability is the balance of flows. And extinction is not minus one species. Extinction is a rewrite of the formula because the system doesn't lose a creature, it loses a function. And the moment of function is missing, the equation still runs, but runs differently. Sometimes quietly, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, until one day the output changes enough that even the market notices. But by then, the system has already moved into a new regime, and that's the reason this framing matters. If you see the ocean as nature, you talk about protection. You see the ocean as an equation, you talk about system integrity. Not because you are emotional, but because you are operational. Because when equation stops working, it doesn't negotiate, it just fails. And the most dangerous part is that the failure is rarely immediate. The system degrades first, it compensates, it hides the damage inside complexity. And that is why we can remove variables without feeling the consequence right away. But the consequence arrives anyway, not as a moral lesson, as a mathematical outcome. One of the most dangerous illusions today is this. If something were really wrong, the market would react. Prices would move, supply would break, and shortages would appear. But that logic only works for simple systems. The ocean is not one of them. Markets don't measure systems, they measure outputs. They don't see equations, they see products. They see fish on shelves, volumes in ports, contracts fulfilled, and prices stable. As long as those outputs remain available, the market assumes that the system is healthy. But that assumption is false because markets are blind to functions, they only respond when availability changes. And in living systems, availability is often the last signal and not the first one. Here's why. When a variable disappears from a living system, the system doesn't stop, it compensates. If one species declines, another expands. If one region collapses, sourcing shifts elsewhere. So, from a market perspective, nothing looks broken. Volumes are replaced, routes are adjusted, prices stabilize, at least temporarily, and the system absorbs the shock internally. But every act of compensation comes at a cost. The equation becomes more stressed, the margins shrink, the buffers disappear. This is where time lag becomes critical. In markets, time lag is efficiency. In ecosystems, time lag is a danger. Because the delay between system damage and market signal can be years, sometimes decades. By the time the market reacts, the species is already gone, the function is already lost, and the equation has already shifted. So the market does not react by asking why, it reacts by adjusting prices, which means the response is not prevention, it's monetization of damage. And that's why shelves staying full tells you nothing. It doesn't mean the system is stable, it means the system is still compensating. And compensation is not sustainability, it's a survival mode. Another reason markets stay quiet is substitution. The ocean doesn't deliver one product, it delivers a network. If one fish disappears, another takes its place in trade. If one stock collapses, another becomes commercially viable. From the market's point of view, that looks like flexibility. From the system's point of view, that looks like erosion, because substitution hides loss of function. The equation still produces output, but with fewer variables doing more work. And that is the most dangerous phase of all, because everything appears normal right before thresholds are crossed. So when people say we don't see any real impact yet, what they really mean is we don't see it in prices yet. But prices are not early warning systems. They are confirmation systems. They react when it's already too late to reverse the process cheaply. That's why the sentence I said earlier is crucial. The market doesn't notice immediately, but the system does. The ocean feels the loss of variable the moment it happens. The market feels it only when the equation can no longer compensate. And by then, we are no longer talking about protection. We are talking about damage control. So let's move from theory to reality for a moment, because the bioequation is not abstract, it's not a metaphor, and it's not something that might happen one day. It's already been rewritten quietly, piece by piece. And every time a variable disappears from this equation, the first signal is not ecological panic, it's economic friction. So let's talk about real cases, not symbols and not save the ocean stories, just systems losing variables. Let's start with the Atlantic cod. For centuries, Atlantic cod wasn't just a fish, it was an industry. Entire coastal regions in Canada and Northern Europe were built around it. Generations worked in fishing, processing, and logistics. For a long time, the system felt stable, predictable, permanent. And then, in the early 1990s, it collapsed. Not overnight, but past a threshold. Overfishing, optimistic stock models, delayed signals. In 1992, Canada imposed a full moratorium. And here is the part people often miss. 30 years later, the code has not truly returned. What disappeared wasn't just a species. What disappeared were jobs, regional stability, and economic continuity. The market adjusted, but downward. Low value species replaced. Cod margins shrank. Communities never fully recovered. The system didn't collapse dramatically. It kept running just at lower level of performance. Now let's look at bluefin tuna. This one didn't disappear, it destabilized. Bluefin tuna used to be broadly accessible. Then demand surged, stocks declined, and scarcity became structural. Quotas tightened, prices exploded. What happened next wasn't protection, it was concentration. Small operators were pushed out, a few actors gained control, illegal fishing increased, the species remained, but the equation changed. Access narrowed with the risk increased and stability declined. The market didn't lose a product, it lost balance. Now let's look at the Pacific sardines. This case shows how scale really works. Sardines were never glamorous fish. They weren't luxury seafood. They were foundational. They supported fisheries, feed production, and the entire food chain along the US West Coast. For decades, they were abundant. Then in 2010, the population collapsed, driven by overfishing and climate shifts. Commercial fishing stopped, and the impact was immediate. Processors shut down, fishermen shifted pressure to other species, cost rippled through the system. And when you remove a mass species, the system doesn't lose a product, it loses structure. Now, the most overlooked case: Caribbean sea urchins. They weren't food and they weren't traded, they didn't appear in markets, they were infrastructure. In the 1980s, a disease wiped out over 90% of them. Their role was simple: control algae on coral reefs. When they disappeared, algae exploded. Corals died, fish population declined, tourism suffered, and fisheries weakened. Decades later, many reefs still haven't recovered, and one small variable removed, and the entire coastal economy degraded. Now look at the pattern. None of these collapsed were immediately visible on supermarket shelves. None triggered instant panic because markets react late. Systems react immediately. The market doesn't notice the missing variable at first. It notices secondary effects: higher prices, volatility, and lower yields. By the time the signal reaches the market, the equation has already changed. And this is the core point of the bio equation. The ocean doesn't fail dramatically, it fails quietly by losing its variables. Not all at once, or one by one. And every time we remove one without understanding its function, we rewrite the equation, whether we intend to or not. What I have just described is one way the equation breaks. Fish are removed directly, quotas are exceeded, stocks decline, markets react, slowly, imperfectly, but visibly. This is the kind of damage the system is used to recognize. There are numbers, there are reports, there are charts that move. But there is another way the bioequation breaks, and it is far harder to detect. Not when we extract variables ourselves, but when the environment removes them for us. Here there are no fishing fleets to blame, no single decision, and no moment when something went wrong. Species disappear not because they were caught, but because the conditions that allowed them to exist no longer do. Water becomes toxic, oxygen disappears, habitats collapse quietly, and from the market's point of view, nothing happens at first. Because no alarms and no price shock and no immediate shortage. But the system feels it, because this is not a reduction in supply, it is loss of function. Let's look at what that actually means in the real world. For decades, the Gulf of Mexico has been one of the most productive fishing regions in the United States. And yet, every summer, a familiar phenomenon returns: the dead zone. Nutrients from agriculture travel down the Mississippi. They feed massive algae blooms. Those blooms consume oxygen as they decay, and entire areas become unsafe to live in. Fish don't die dramatically, they leave or suffocate. Shrimp, bottom dwelling species, the functional layers of the food chain, disappear first. From the market's perspective, this looks like variability. Bad seasons, weather effects, normal volatility. But economically, something deeper is happening. Fishing effort increases, costs rise, catch becomes less predictable. The system compensates it until it can't. The equation hasn't lost one variable, it has lost stabilizing mechanism. The Baltic Sea is one of the most studied seas in the world and one of the most degraded. Decades of nutrient runoff, industrial discharge, and limited water exchange have turned large parts of it into oxygen poor zones. Cod populations collapse, spawning grounds fail, entire trophic levels weaken. This is not overfishing alone, it is a habitat failure. Markets respond late, but the time quotas are adjusted. The biological capacity to recover is already compromised. What disappears here is not a species, but a role. Predators vanish, imbalances grow, low value species dominate. The economy adapts, but downward. Cheaper fish, lower margins, reduced resilience. The equation still exists, but it produces a different outcome. Across parts of Southeast and East Asia, the pattern is quieter and larger. Rapid coastal development, industrial discharge, agriculture runoff, untreated wastewater, mangroves disappear, shallow coastal ecosystems collapse. Fish don't die on camera, they migrate. Local fisheries decline without a clear cause. Communities adapt without understanding why. The market absorbs its noise, more imports, more pressure elsewhere, more distance between cause and effect. But function has been removed, and once removed, it does not return on demand. Here is the critical point. The market doesn't notice immediately, but the system does. And environmental loss doesn't arrive as a shortage, it arrives as instability. More effort for less output, higher risk for lower certainty, more intervention for weaker recovery. This is what a broken equation looks like. Not a collapse, not a crisis, just degradation. A degradation is far harder to reverse than a simple supply shock. Let's talk about the point where the ocean equation stops being respected and the market quietly substitutes it. Because when people hear species disappearing, they often imagine something dramatic. A headline, a sudden shortage. In reality, the system is more subtle. The ocean can lose variables for years and still look normal on the supermarket shelf. Not because the equation is stable, but because the market is very good at hiding instability. Here is the mechanism. Demand grows and population grows and consumption grows. Global trade makes seafood available everywhere, all the time, at scale. At the same time, natural supply does not scale the same way. You can expand farms, you can expand factories, and you can expand extraction. But you cannot expand an ecosystem on command. An ecosystem has limits: reproduction rates, food availability, habitat stability, temperature ranges, oxygen levels, migration patterns, and time lags. And when those limits are pushed, the ocean doesn't produce less in a neat, linear way. It reorganizes. So, what do we do when demand overtakes natural capacity? We introduce an artificial variable. We don't reduce demand to match reality. We don't regulate consumption to fit the system's ability to recover. And we don't design the economy around biological limits. Instead, we compensate. Fish farms appear, aquaculture expands, artificial reproduction becomes the new stabilizer. And from economic perspective, this looks like a success because in economic equation variables are interchangeable. If supply drops in one place, you source somewhere else. If one species becomes scarce, you switch species. If prices rise, you substitute. Scarcity threatens stability, you manufacture stability. So the numbers can still work. Supply is restored, prices remain manageable, consumer behavior barely changes, and the visible signals of collapse are delayed. That is exactly the problem, because what is being stabilized is not the ocean. What is being stabilized is the market. This is the difference between the economic equation and the bio equation. In economic equation, the goal is still output, volume, price, availability, and growth. And in a bio equation, the goal is a function, balance, interaction, regeneration, and system integrity. Those are not the same thing. A farm can produce protein, but it cannot replace the role of a living variable inside the ocean system. Because in a bioequation, species is not a food, it is a function. It occupies a role in a chain, it regulates something, it interacts with predators and prey, it influences habitats, nutrient movement, and the stability of other variables. So, when we remove a variable from the ocean and replace its output artificially, we are not restoring the equation. We are doing something else. We are creating a parallel equation that feeds demand while the original equations continues losing functionality. And this is why it becomes dangerous, because the market doesn't notice it immediately and the system does. The market sees supply is stable and the ocean experiences functions are disappearing. And the most deceptive part is that both can be true at the same time, for a while. This is where the invisible transition happens. We start behaving as if we can treat ocean depletion like any other supply chain issue. If one region becomes less productive, we shift to another. If coastal zones degrade, we fish deeper. If one sea becomes unstable, we redirect fleets elsewhere. We relocate pressure. It feels like problem solving, but structurally, it's displacement because you cannot relocate indefinitely. You can move to a new area, but that new area is not infinite. It is simply the next part of the same system. So, what looks like flexibility is actually a countdown, and fish farms accelerate that illusion because they allow the economy to keep demanding more without confronting the system's recovery speed. They allow us to avoid the real equation. Demand should be regulated by natural capacity. Instead, we do the opposite. We force supply to match demand, and if the ocean cannot do it, we build a substitute. That is the key signal. Fish farms are not proof of innovation, they are proof of a mismatch. A mismatch between what the living system can provide and what the economic system expects. And yes, mathematically, you could say if the bioequation loses one variable, we can add an artificial variable elsewhere and keep the total output constant. But that is exactly the misunderstanding. Because bio here doesn't mean we can't grow fish. It means the ocean equation is a living architecture where variables are not interchangeable. You can generate volume, but you cannot recreate the same system role. You can replace food supply, but you cannot replace ecosystems function. And once you see that, fish farms stop looking like a solution and start looking like a warning light. A warning light that we have moved into compensation mode. And compensation mode has a very specific cost. It delays feedback. It removes the immediate market signal that would normally force a correction. Scarcity. Scarcity would normally change behavior. It would make demand slow down, it would force regulation, and it would make the system visible. But when we compensate with artificial supply, we neutralize scarcity. We neutralize the signal. So the depletion continues without political urgency because people don't feel it. Not in prices, not in availability, not in daily life. Meanwhile, the ocean is losing variables that cannot be artificially replaced. And that is why the consequences arrive later and arrive wider. Because biological systems don't fail in one place and stay there. They cascade. A missing variable alters pressure elsewhere, a migration changes competition patterns, a dead zone removes nursery grounds, a collapse in one link forces shifts in the entire chain. So, what looks like a small economic substitution becomes a structural, ecological rewrite. And again, this is not activism, this is not emotion, this is systems logic. A market can stay stable while an ecosystem degrades because markets are designed for substitution and ecosystems are not. So the real risk is not that farm exists, the risk is what farm represent. That we have normalized a world where demand is no longer constrained by biological recovery, where the economy treats the ocean as a supplier that must keep up, and if it cannot, we manufacture a workaround. That is not sustainability, that is postponement. And it creates the next phase of the story. Because once compensation becomes standard, the system starts living on a borrowed time. Borrowed fish stocks, borrowed ecosystems, borrowed stability. We can keep moving pressure to another regions and we can keep expanding artificial supply. But if the living equation keeps losing variables faster than it can regenerate them, then sooner or later the substitution strategy hits a wall. At that point, the ocean does not run out of fish. It loses function, and when a system loses function, the equation doesn't become smaller, it becomes different. And different systems produce different outcomes, often irreversible ones. So this block is not saying farms are bad, it's saying something more precise. Fish farms are a sign that we are trying to solve a biological equation with an economic tool. And that only works until the living architecture itself crosses a threshold where compensation can no longer hide what's missing. That is the moment when the market finally notices what the system has been experiencing for a long time. So let's step back and connect the dots. What I have been talking about is not just fish, species, or ecosystems. It's an effort. As stocks decline, fishing doesn't stop. It expands. Fleets travel further and fishing zones move outward. Distances increase and more fuel is burned. More nets are deployed and more gear is lost or abandoned. Every ton of fish now requires more energy, more infrastructure, and more material effort than before. That is one waste pattern. Then I looked at ecological collapse, dead zones, poisoned coastal waters, migration away from traditional grounds. When ecosystems fail locally, extraction doesn't slow down, it relocates. New areas are pressured, new routes are opened. New systems are built to compensate for what no longer functions naturally. And that is another waste pattern. And when natural supply can no longer meet demand, we introduce artificial ones. Farms, installations, controlled environments, additional structures in water. Each of them requires energy, each of them requires materials, each of them adds another layer of human footprint into the ocean. This is not about good or bad intentions. It's about system behavior. When demand is not aligned with the regenerative capacity, the response is always the same. More effort, more substitution, more infrastructure, and more waste. Not as a pollution alone, but as an accumulated traces of expanded human activity. The ocean is not just absorbing our waste, it is being reshaped by the way we compensate for imbalance instead of correcting it. This is where the idea of waste changes meaning. Waste is not only what we throw away, It is what we are forced to add when systems stop working as they once did. And that is the pattern. That is the equation. And that is why ocean of waste is not about ecology alone, but about how expanding effort leaves expanding traces long before collapse becomes visible.